Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Michael Collins assassination. Imagine, if you will, the city of Cork in the earliest hours of Tuesday, August 22nd, 1922. The world is bathed in a soft, silver-gray light, the kind that only exists before the sun has truly claimed the sky. The air is damp, carrying the heavy scent of the River Lee and the faint, salty tang of the Atlantic Ocean creeping in from the coast. The streets are paved with stone and history, and at this hour they are perfectly still. There is a profound hush over the city, a brief moment of peace in a land that has known very little of it. We are standing outside the Imperial Hotel on South Mall, where the grand facade of the building looms like a silent sentinel. The windows are dark, reflecting the pale morning mist that clings to the eaves and swirls around the heavy wooden doors. The Imperial Hotel has been a place of sanctuary and strategy for the last 2 nights. Inside its thick walls, the man known to many as the Big Fellow has been resting, though his rest has been fitful at best. Michael Collins is only 31 years old, yet he carries the weight of a nation on his shoulders. This morning, as the clock nears 6:15, the silence of the street is finally broken. It begins with the low, rhythmic thrum of engines, a mechanical heartbeat that seems to vibrate through the very pavement. One by one, 4 vehicles are brought around to the Pembroke Street entrance. They idle there, their exhausts puffing white plumes into the chilly air, merging with the fog. The yellow paint of the primary car stands out against the gray stone of the hotel, a splash of defiant color in a world of shadows. This is a Leyland 8, an open-top touring car with a long, elegant bonnet and leather seats that are still beaded with the night's dew. Behind the yellow touring car sits the formidable silhouette of an armored car. Its name is Slieveneman, a Rolls-Royce whippet that looks like a prehistoric beast made of riveted steel. Its turret is silent now, but the heavy Vickers machine gun within serves as a grim reminder of the Civil War that has fractured the country. In front of the convoy, a lone motorcyclist, Lieutenant John Smythe, adjusts his goggles. His Triumph motorcycle clicks and pops as the metal expands with the heat. Between these vehicles is a Crossley tender, a rugged truck filled with 8 riflemen and 2 machine gunners. Their uniforms are a deep forest green, and they sit in rows, their rifles held loosely between their knees. There is very little chatter among them. The gravity of the journey ahead is felt by everyone, even if it is not spoken. They are preparing to enter West Cork, a territory where the winding roads and deep valleys are held by those who now call Michael Collins an enemy. Michael Collins emerges from the hotel, and for a moment, he pauses on the threshold. He is a tall man, broad-shouldered and commanding, but those close to him can see the strain. For several days, he has been suffering from a fever and a nagging cold. His doctor had urged him to stay in bed, to let the illness pass, but Collins is a man driven by a restless energy. He is a man in a hurry to find a way out of the darkness. He has been meeting with neutral officers and former comrades, searching for a path to end the fratricidal conflict. His mindset is one of weary optimism. He believes that if he can just speak to the right people, if he can walk the soil of his home county, he can settle this bloody business. "They won't shoot me in my own county," he had told his worried aides. It was a sentiment born of a deep, perhaps dangerous, love for the people of Cork. He settles into the rear seat of the yellow Leyland, sliding in beside his friend and aide, General Emmett Dalton. Dalton is younger, a man who's seen the horrors of the Great War and now finds himself navigating the complexities of an Irish Revolution. The 2 men speak softly, their voices lost to the steady growl of the touring car's 8-cylinder engine. Private Michael Smith Corey, the driver, grips the steering wheel, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There is a reserve driver, a man named Quinn, sitting beside him, ready to take over if the long day demands it. Collins reaches into his pocket and pulls out a small, numbered notebook. With a steady hand, he jots down the time. 6:15 in the morning. He lists the destinations for the day: Macrum, Bandon, Clonakilty, Skibbereen. It is a sentimental journey as much as a military one, a tour of the places that shaped him. With a signal from the motorcyclist, the convoy begins to move. The tires crunch over the stray grit on the road as they turn onto the South Mall. They pass the grand architecture of the banks and the silent storefronts, heading toward Washington Street. The sound of the engines echoes off the buildings, a fading roar that leaves the city center to return to its morning slumber. As they leave the paved streets of the city behind, the road begins to narrow, and the green hedgerows of the countryside rise up to meet them. The sun is still a pale promise behind the clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the fields. They are moving west, toward the heart of the rebellion, toward the rugged beauty of the Valley of the Flowers. For now, the journey is peaceful. The wind brushes against their faces, and the smell of wood smoke begins to rise from the chimneys of early-rising farmers. Michael Collins leans back, watching the landscape of his youth unfold, unaware that the wheels of fate have already begun to turn. The city of Cork begins to fall away, its stone buildings slowly replaced by the encroaching green of the Lee Valley. It is just after 6 o'clock on this Tuesday morning, the 22nd of August, 1922. The air is heavy, damp with a late summer mist that clings to the riverbanks and softens the edges of the horizon. As the convoy leaves the paved streets of the South Mall, the tires find the uneven, shifting rhythm of the country roads. There is a specific sound to this transition: the steady, mechanical thrum of the engines echoing off the farmhouse walls, a stark intrusion into the deep quietude of the rural morning. Leading the way is the Scout, a lone figure on a Triumph Model H motorcycle. The rider, Lieutenant Smith, leans into the curves of the road, his eyes scanning every hedge and every bend for the slightest sign of movement. Behind him, the main body of the escort begins to stretch out like a serpent of steel and wood winding through the hills. Following the motorcyclist is the Crossley Tender, a rugged, open-topped truck carrying approximately 12 soldiers of the National Army. Their green uniforms are already damp from the humidity, their faces set in the grim, silent mask of men who know they are entering deeply hostile territory. They sit on narrow wooden benches, rifles held tightly between their knees, while a Lewis machine gun is mounted prominently near the front, its large cooling jacket reflecting the pale, early light. The vehicle rattles over every stone and rut, the suspension groaning under the weight of the men and their equipment. This is what many call Rebel Cork, a landscape where the hedges seem to have eyes and the ancient stone walls are more than mere boundaries. They are potential breastworks for an unseen enemy. The soldiers do not speak. They watch the ridges, the gaps in the gorse, and the silent, thatched cottages that pass by like ghosts in the morning fog. In the center of this procession sits the yellow touring car, a Leyland Straight 8. It is an elegant, powerful machine, a gift that Michael Collins himself has grown fond of. Its bright, sun-colored paint is a bold, perhaps even dangerous statement amidst the drab grays and deep greens of the countryside. Inside, the leather seats are cool and smooth to the touch. Collins sits in the back, his large, restless frame filling the space, his eyes constantly moving across the terrain. Beside him is Major General Emmett Dalton, his close military aide and a veteran of the Great War. The engine of the Leyland is a marvel of its era, a smooth, 8-cylinder hum that contrasts sharply with the frantic, metallic rattling of the tender in front of them. There is a peculiar intimacy within the car, a shared tension between the men as they navigate the narrow, winding lanes. They are traveling through the heart of the territory Collins knows best, the land of his childhood, yet it has become a place of profound and deadly uncertainty. Bringing up the rear is the most formidable member of the group, the armored car known as Slieve na Mban. Built on a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost chassis and encased in thick, riveted steel plates. It is a rolling fortress named after the Mountain of the Women in Tipperary. The vehicle is a slow, heavy beast, its engine laboring with a deep, resonant growl on the steeper gradients of the Cork Hills. The driver feels the vibration of the six-cylinder engine through the steering wheel, a low-frequency thrum that vibrates in the chest of anyone nearby. Atop the car, the circular turret houses a Vickers 303 machine gun, its barrel pointing toward the rear to cover their retreat. The gunner, a man named John McPeak, sits in the cramped, oil-scented interior, peering through the narrow vision slits at the receding road. The armored car is the convoy's ultimate insurance, a steel shadow that provides a sense of security, yet its immense weight makes it cumbersome and slow on these twisting, unpaved tracks. The landscape of West Cork is one of rugged, breathtaking beauty, especially in these early hours. The fields are divided by ancient stone walls, overgrown with brambles and wild fuchsia, vibrant red flowers that locals sometimes call the tears of blood. As the sun begins to climb, it struggles to pierce the thick, milky blanket of mist that settles in the deep valleys. The convoy passes through the village of Ballincollig and moves toward Macram, where the dark ruins of the castle stand as a silent reminder of centuries of conflict. The road narrows further here, the dense hedges pressing in on the vehicles and forcing the convoy to slow to a cautious crawl. Every bridge they cross has been inspected for signs of sabotage. Every fallen branch is viewed as a potential trap. The silence of the countryside is deceptive. To the untrained eye, it is a peaceful pastoral scene, but to these men, every shadow under an oak tree or every dip in the rocky terrain is a place where an ambush could be waiting. The very air seems to hold its breath as they pass. They move deeper into the valley of the Bride River, heading toward the crossroads that would later become a name synonymous with tragedy, Béal na Bláth. The smell of the morning is a complex mixture of damp earth, peat smoke drifting from distant chimneys, and the sharp, acrid scent of petrol and hot engine oil. The tires crunch rhythmically over the loose gravel, a sound that seems amplified in the morning stillness. Collins watches the passing fields with a look of recognition, perhaps seeing the familiar contours of the land he once roamed as a young boy. But today, the hills of home have been transformed into a labyrinth of tactical advantages and hidden dangers. The convoy is a tiny, mechanical pulse in a vast, wild landscape that has seen many such marches, yet none quite so heavy with the weight of history. The mist finally begins to lift, revealing the jagged outcrops of rock and the deep, green hollows where the shadows linger just a little longer than they should. They are moving into the mouth of the flowers, and the world is watching. The morning of August 22nd, 1922, unfolded with a golden clarity that seemed at odds with the tension gripping the nation. As the small convoy pulled away from the bustling streets of Cork City at 15 minutes past 6, the air was still cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and river mist. At the head of the line, a lone motorcyclist, Lieutenant John Smythe, scouted the path ahead, his engine a rhythmic pulse against the quiet morning. Behind him followed a heavy Crossley tender, its wooden slats vibrating with the presence of 10 armed soldiers. Then came the centerpiece, a vibrant yellow Leyland 8 touring car. In its back seat sat Michael Collins, his broad shoulders filling the space beside his aide-de-camp, Emmett Dalton. Bringing up the rear was the massive, hulking shadow of the Rolls-Royce armored car, famously named Sliab na Mban, or the Mountain of the Women. Its steel plates groaned as it negotiated the narrow, winding lanes leading toward the west. By the time the sun had climbed higher, beginning to bake the dust of the dry summer roads into a fine white powder, the convoy arrived in Macram. It was approximately 8 o'clock in the morning. The town was a patchwork of shadows and sunlight, where the locals watched from doorways with a mixture of awe and trepidation. Collins, despite being the commander-in-chief and a man with a heavy price on his head, seemed almost jubilant. They stopped at Williams's Hotel, also known as the Castle Hotel, where the smell of frying bacon and strong tea wafted through the open windows. Inside the bar, Collins was a whirlwind of energy. Witnesses would later recall how he laughed and joked, even playfully picking up a barmaid named Aileen Baker and carrying her up the stairs in a moment of sheer, boyish bravado. It was a fleeting glimpse of the man behind the myth, restless, magnetic, and seemingly untouchable. But the war was never far away. The journey toward Bandon was forced into a series of detours and winding backroads. The main bridges had been blown by anti-treaty forces, their jagged stone remains lying in the riverbeds like broken promises. This meant the convoy had to navigate the rugged terrain of the Bride Valley, moving through the village of Kilmurray. The landscape here was lush and deceptively peaceful, a sea of deep emerald green under a cloudless sky. The heat began to intensify, the metal of the armored car becoming hot to the touch, and the soldiers in the tender shifted uncomfortably in their heavy wool tunics. Collins, however, remained vigilant, his eyes scanning the horizon of his home county. He was back in West Cork, the place that had forged him, and he believed, perhaps too fervently, that his own people would never turn their rifles against him in these familiar hills. Around 9 in the morning, the convoy reached a quiet, nondescript crossroads that would soon be etched into the soul of Irish history. This was Béal na Bláth. The name itself is poetic, translating to the mouth of the flowers, or perhaps the mouth of the dairy. At that hour, it was a place of profound stillness. The valley was a natural amphitheater, with steep, gorse-covered hills rising on either side of a narrow, twisting road. A small stream trickled nearby, and the only sound was the lowing of cattle in the distance and the clicking of the cooling engines as the convoy slowed to a crawl. They were unsure of which path to take, as the signposts had been removed or turned around to confuse the Free State troops. The beauty of the valley was haunting, a pocket of silence where the shadows of the hills stretched long and thin across the gravel road. They stopped briefly outside Long's pub, a modest building nestled near the junction. Collins leaned out of the yellow touring car, his face framed by the dust of the road, and called out to a local man standing nearby. That man was Denny's Long, known to many as Denny the Dane. Collins asked for the shortest route to Bandon, and Denny pointed the way, his eyes lingering on the famous figure in the back seat. It was a moment of supreme irony, a pivot point upon which history turned. Denny Long was a Republican scout. As the convoy rumbled away, the sound of their engines fading into the distance toward Crookstown, Denny moved quickly. He realized that the commander-in-chief had just passed through their territory and, more importantly, would likely have to return the same way. The message was sent, and the quiet valley of the flowers began to stir with a different kind of energy. The convoy pressed on, finally rolling into the town of Bandon mid-morning. For Collins, this was a homecoming. He met with Major General Sean Hales at Lee's Hotel, their conversation a mix of military business and the desperate hope for a ceasefire. As they stood on the street, surrounded by the sights and sounds of the market town, Collins felt a surge of confidence. He famously told Hales that the conflict would soon be over, his voice steady and full of conviction. He was in his own country now, surrounded by the echoes of his childhood and the people he had fought so hard to liberate. As he prepared to continue further west toward Clonakilty, he looked back toward the road they had traveled. He was unaware that the valley they had passed through so peacefully just an hour before was no longer empty. The trap was being laid, stone by stone, in the heat of the afternoon sun. The convoy rattled onward, leaving the town of Bandon behind. The sun of that Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 1922, climbed higher into the sky, casting a golden, hazy light over the rolling hills of West Cork. Michael Collins sat in the back of the open touring car, his uniform dusted with the fine, pale grit of the country roads. As the vehicles climbed the winding paths toward Sam's Cross, the air grew cooler, scented with the wild gorse and the damp, earthy breath of the valley. This was the heart of the country he had known as a boy, a landscape of jagged rock and deep green fields that felt as much a part of him as his own heartbeat. To any other man, these narrow lanes might have felt like a trap, but to Michael, they felt like a long-awaited embrace. He looked out at the stone walls and the familiar slopes, perhaps seeing not a battlefield, but the ghosts of the child he once was, running through these very fields before the world knew his name. They reached the small crossroads known as Sam's Cross mid-afternoon. It was a humble place, but for the commander-in-chief, it was the center of his universe. The vehicles slowed to a halt outside a modest, whitewashed building with a slate roof, the Four Alls Pub. The establishment was owned by his cousin, Jeremiah Collins, and as the heavy boots of the soldiers hit the dry ground, a quiet hush fell over the area. There was a strange tension in the air, the kind that exists when a legendary figure returns to the place of his birth while a war rages around him. Michael stepped down from the car, his frame tall and imposing in his military tunic, yet his expression softened as he looked at the door. Here he was not the general or the big fellow. He was simply Michael, the youngest son of the Collins family, coming home for a brief, stolen moment of peace. Inside the pub, the light was dim and filtered through small windows, catching the dancing dust motes in the air. The smell was a comforting mixture of spilled porter, dry sawdust on the floor, and the faint, sweet tang of a turf fire smoldering in the hearth. It was a sensory map of his youth. Cousin Jeremiah greeted him with a nod and a look that carried the weight of years. A few locals sat in the shadows, their caps pulled low, watching the man who had outsmarted the British Empire now standing at their bar. Michael leaned against the dark wood of the counter and ordered a drink. For a few minutes, the war felt leagues away. He spoke with the men not of politics or treaties, but of the harvest, the neighbors, and the health of old friends. It was a deliberate turning away from the darkness that followed his every step, an attempt to ground himself in the soil that had raised him. The conversation eventually turned to the unrest that gripped the country. Michael's voice, usually sharp and commanding, was quiet and heavy with a strange kind of resolve. He looked at the men around him and spoke the words that would later haunt the memories of everyone in that room. He told them, "I'm going to settle this thing. I'm going to put an end to this bloody war." He meant it with every fiber of his being. He was exhausted by the brother-against-brother conflict that had turned his beloved Cork into a maze of ambushes and broken bridges. There was an intimacy in his words, a promise made to his own people that he would bring them peace, even if the cost was his own safety. He seemed to believe that his connection to this land would protect him, a shield forged from the very hills that surrounded the crossroads. Before leaving, Michael took a short walk to Woodfield, the farm where he was born. The sight that met him was a grim reminder of the price of revolution. The family home, a place of warmth and stories, now stood as a blackened shell, burned to the ground by British forces during the previous conflict. He stood before the scorched stones, the wind whistling through the empty window frames where his mother and father had once looked out at the dawn. It was a profound, silent moment of grief. The ruins of his past were a mirror to the state of the nation, broken, scarred, but still standing. He reached out and touched the rough, soot-stained masonry, perhaps realizing that there was no going back to the way things were. The boy from Sam's Cross had become a man of history, and history was a cruel master that demanded everything. As he walked back to the waiting convoy, his officers were anxious. General Emmett Dalton urged him to move quickly, reminding him that they were in the heart of anti-treaty territory, where every hedge could hide a rifle. But Michael brushed the concerns aside with a confident, almost reckless smile. He famously remarked to his comrades that they wouldn't shoot him in his own county. It was a sentiment born of a deep, perhaps naive, love for his neighbors. He couldn't bring himself to believe that the men he had fought beside against the crown would now pull a trigger on him in the shadow of his own birthplace. He climbed back into the yellow touring car, the engine turning over with a low, rhythmic growl that echoed off the hills. He waved a final goodbye to the small crowd at Sam's Cross, the sun beginning its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long, thin shadows across the road that led east, toward the valley of Béal na Bláth. Above the valley of Béal na Bláth, the world felt suspended in a heavy, golden stillness. On the ridges that framed the narrow road below, the summer grass was long and dry, swaying slightly in a breeze that carried the scent of gorse and distant peat smoke. Here, among the jagged rocks and the shadows of the hills, the air was different than it had been in the bustling streets of Cork City. It was quiet, but it was a quiet charged with a terrible, patient energy. These were the heights of the ridge, the vantage points where men now crouched with rifles across their knees, their eyes fixed on the empty ribbon of road that wound through the ravine like a discarded thread. For these watchers, the war had become a matter of landscape and geometry, of waiting for the perfect moment to close a trap that had been decades in the making. The planning had begun hours earlier, in the bright, sharp light of the morning. A local sentry named Dinny Long had been standing at the crossroads when the dust of a high-speed convoy first appeared on the horizon. He had watched as the motorbikes and the heavy armored car rolled past, and he had recognized the man in the touring car instantly. Word traveled fast through the network of local farms. At Murray's farmhouse, which served as a temporary headquarters for the anti-treaty forces, the news sparked a flurry of grim activity. Liam Deasy and Tom Hales, men who had once fought alongside the passenger in that car, now had to decide the fate of their former leader. They knew the terrain of West Cork better than any general in Dublin, and they knew that there were only so many ways back from Bandon. The decision was made to wait, to watch, and to see if the road would bring the big fellow back to them. The men moved with a practiced, silent efficiency to prepare the ground. They dragged a heavy dray cart across the road at a narrow bend, a physical barrier designed to force any vehicle to a grinding halt. But the cart was only part of the mechanism. Near Carroll's Bridge, engineers worked in the dirt, burying a large mine beneath the surface of the track. It was a crude but lethal device, its presence hidden by loose soil and the natural irregularities of the country lane. As the sun climbed higher into the sky, the hillsides became a gallery of hidden observers. Some 30 or 40 men were spread out along the upper laneway and the high ground, finding cover behind stone walls and thickets of bramble. They were ghosts in the landscape, invisible to anyone traveling below, yet they held the valley in a tightening grip that felt more like a heavy shroud than a simple blockade. The afternoon stretched out into an eternity of waiting. The heat of the August sun pressed down on the men in the hills, making the wool of their coats itch and the metal of their rifles grow warm to the touch. In the silence, every sound was amplified. The distant lowing of a cow, the repetitive call of a bird, the rustle of a rabbit through the undergrowth, each noise caused fingers to tighten on triggers before the tension subsided once more. They watched the shadows of the trees grow long and thin, stretching across the road like bars. There is a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from standing still, a mental toll paid in the currency of doubt and memory. These men were not strangers to the man they were waiting for. They were his neighbors, his former brothers-in-arms, and the weight of that history hung in the humid air as heavily as the coming rain, turning the weight into a somber meditation on loyalty and loss. As the clock ticked toward evening, the atmosphere shifted. The brilliant blue of the day began to fade into the soft, bruised purples of a West Cork twilight. By 7 o'clock, the road remained empty. Doubts began to circulate among the commanders. Had the convoy taken a different route? Had they decided to stay in Bandon for the night? Liam Deasy and his officers held a hurried consultation in the fading light. It seemed increasingly unlikely that the commander-in-chief would risk the journey so late in the day. The order was eventually given to stand down. The main body of the ambush party began to disperse, moving away from their positions toward the warmth of nearby cottages and the local pub. They were tired, hungry, and convinced that the opportunity had passed them by. The valley seemed to exhale, releasing the coiled tension of the day as the men vanished into the trees. Even as the majority of the men left, a few stayed behind to finish the work of clearing the site. They began the delicate and dangerous task of dismantling the mine and moving the heavy dray cart. The tension had broken, replaced by the mundane rhythm of retreat. A soft mist, characteristic of the Irish coast, began to roll in from the sea, settling into the hollows of the valley and blurring the edges of the world. It was a time of transition, where the day's violence felt like a theoretical possibility that had been averted by the simple passage of time. But then, through the dampening veil of the mist, a new sound began to vibrate through the earth. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming, far to the south, growing steadily louder with every passing heartbeat. The engine of a heavy vehicle was laboring up the rise, its mechanical voice cutting through the evening fog. The handful of men remaining on the ridge froze. The sound was unmistakable. It was the mechanical growl of a convoy, returning exactly as they had feared and hoped hours before. In the dim light of nearly 8 o'clock, the first motorcycle emerged through the haze, its headlamp cutting a weak path through the gloaming. The trap was half disassembled, the mine was disconnected, and the main force was miles away. But the moment of collision was now inevitable. The watchers on the ridge retreated into the shadows of the upper lane, their hearts racing as the yellow touring car came into view. They reached for their weapons one last time, realizing that the long wait was over, and the silence of the valley was about to be shattered forever. The clock had begun its slow descent toward 5 in the afternoon as the convoy pulled away from the hotel in Bandon. The air was thick with the scent of roasted tea leaves and the heavy, metallic tang of the engines. Michael Collins had spent the last hour in a pocket of relative calm, but the business of the day was far from finished. The decision was made to begin the return journey toward Cork City. It was a moment of transition, where the urgency of his military inspections began to soften into the quiet reflection of a man returning to his roots. The sun, now hanging lower in the sky, cast long, distorted shadows across the cobblestones as the yellow touring car hummed with a low, steady vibration. This was the Leyland Thomas Straight 8, an open-top machine that felt more like a vessel of state than a tactical vehicle. Its leather seats were warm from the day's heat, and as the wheels began to turn, a fine layer of West Cork dust rose to meet them. As they cleared the outskirts of the town, the primary question of the journey took hold. Which road would lead them home? In the world of military strategy, returning by the exact same path one took in the morning is considered a cardinal sin. It offers the enemy a second chance to correct the mistakes of the first. Major General Emmett Dalton, sitting beside Collins, felt the weight of this tactical vulnerability. He was a man of the Great War, a veteran of the Somme, and his instincts were screaming of the risks. He knew the Republican forces had been busy. They had spent the weeks prior systematically dismantling the infrastructure of the county, blowing up stone bridges and felling ancient trees to choke the veins of travel. The reality was stark. There were very few ways back to Cork that weren't already blocked or destroyed. Despite the lingering threat, the decision was made to retrace their steps through the winding valley of Béal na Bláth. The mood inside the touring car was strangely serene. To Dalton's surprise, the commander-in-chief seemed almost buoyant. Earlier that day, as they passed the ruins of his childhood home at Sam's Cross, Collins had pointed out the blackened stone walls with a melancholy smile. He told Dalton that was where he was born, and for a moment, the weight of the Civil War seemed to lift from his shoulders. Now, as the car navigated the rolling hills, Collins was leaning back, the wind catching his hair. He was in his own county, among his own people, and he maintained a stubborn, almost fatalistic confidence. When the topic of a potential ambush was raised, Collins had simply remarked that they would never shoot him in his own county. It was a sentiment born of deep affection for the land. Yet it stood in chilling contrast to the reality of the war-torn landscape they were traversing. The light was beginning to change now, entering that period the locals called the twilight hour. The vibrant greens of the Cork hillsides were deepening into shades of bruised purple and charcoal. The sun was no longer a golden disk, but a glowing ember sinking behind the ridges, creating a world of high contrast where every hedge and stone wall could hide a dozen men. Inside the car, the roar of the 8-cylinder engine was the only constant. Dalton watched the road ahead with narrowed eyes, his hand never far from his sidearm. He noticed how the light played off the brass buttons of Collins's tunic, making him a prominent, gleaming target against the darkening interior of the vehicle. The open top of the car, which had felt so refreshing in the heat of midday, now felt like a terrifying exposure. They were approaching the valley known as the Mouth of Flowers. The road here narrowed significantly, hemmed in by steep, gorse-covered slopes that seemed to lean over the convoy. The mechanical growl of the cars echoed off the hills, announcing their arrival long before they could be seen. Collins remained quiet, perhaps lost in the myriad thoughts of a long day, or perhaps finally sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The air had turned cool, and the scent of damp earth and crushed grass drifted into the car. There was a profound stillness in the valley, the kind of silence that feels heavy and intentional. The decisions made at twilight, the choice to return the way they came, and the insistence on an open route were all converging toward a single point in time. Every revolution of the tires was bringing them closer to the place where the shadows were longest, and where the men on the ridge had just begun to stir. As the car descended into the bowl of the valley, the visibility dropped further. The world was now composed of silhouettes. The motorcycle outrider up ahead flickered in and out of view as he rounded the sharp bends. Dalton gripped the side of the car, his knuckles white. He could see the tension in the driver's shoulders, the way the man squinted against the fading glare of the horizon. They were in the heart of the ambush territory now, a place they had passed safely only 12 hours before. But the morning's luck was a distant memory. The tactical risk was no longer a theory discussed over tea. It was a physical presence, as real as the cold wind hitting their faces. The convoy pressed on, moving deeper into the throat of the valley, while the sun finally dipped below the world, leaving only the pale, ghostly glow of the evening sky to light their path. The road into the valley of Béal na Bláth was little more than a dirt track, a narrow ribbon of gray winding through the dense, emerald landscape of West Cork. As the convoy descended, the high earthen banks on either side began to rise, acting like natural walls that funneled the sound of the engines into a low, rhythmic thrum. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening on this 22nd day of August, 1922. The sun had begun its slow retreat behind the hills, casting long, distorted shadows across the path. The light was transitionary, a soft amber glow that blurred the edges of the gorse and the stone walls, making the world seem quiet and expectant. The air was heavy with the scent of damp moss and the cooling earth, a fragrance that felt both ancient and grounding as the vehicles pushed deeper into the hollow of the glen. At the front of the line, the motorcycle outrider, Lieutenant Smythe, felt the shift in the atmosphere first. He rounded a sharp, blind bend where the road dipped toward a small bridge. Suddenly, his boots scraped against the gravel as he applied the brakes, bringing his machine to a controlled but hurried stop. There, blocking the path entirely, sat a heavy wooden dray cart. It was a brewery wagon, massive and weathered, tilted awkwardly on its side so that its iron-rimmed wheels pointed toward the sky like the limbs of a fallen animal. Beside it, a large tree had been felled with calculated precision, its leafy branches sprawling across the remaining gaps in the road. It was a barrier of stone and wood, immovable and deliberate, designed to bring any progress to a dead halt in the most vulnerable part of the valley. Behind the motorcycle, the yellow Leyland Thomas touring car ground its gears as the driver reacted to the sudden obstruction. The vehicle lurched, its tires biting into the loose soil. In the backseat, Michael Collins and Emmett Dalton were thrown forward slightly by the momentum. The smell of hot oil and exhaust fumes billowed into the open-top car, mingling with the cool evening mist. Behind them, the massive Rolls-Royce armored car, known as the Slyabna Mban, let out a deep, mechanical growl as it slowed. The vibration of its engine seemed to shake the very floor of the valley, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the chests of the men. For a few seconds, the only sounds were the ticking of hot engines and the heavy, metallic clicking of the armored car's turret as it began a slow, cautious rotation, searching the heights for a threat that was not yet visible. The realization washed over the convoy with the cold clarity of a mountain stream. This was no accidental breakdown of a local farmer's cart. The positioning was too perfect, the obstruction too complete. Dalton, a man of sharp military instincts, looked up at the slopes of the hills that pressed in on them. To their left, the ground rose sharply, covered in a thick carpet of purple heather and jagged rocks. To their right, the land fell away toward a small stream, but the banks were too steep for the heavy cars to navigate. They were caught in a narrow corridor, a kill zone where the geometry of the earth favored the hidden observer. The silence that followed the slowing of the engines was not the silence of peace, but the heavy, pressurized silence of a spring being coiled tight, waiting for the moment of release. Collins remained seated for a moment, his gaze fixed on the barricade ahead. His face, usually so full of movement and energy, was a mask of focused intensity. He knew this terrain. He had grown up in these hills, played in these fields, and led a revolution from these very shadows. There was a profound irony in the setting. A man who had spent years as a phantom, elusive and unseen, was now the stationary target in the center of a trap. The men in the Crossley tender behind him began to scramble out, their hobnailed boots striking the road with a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks. They moved with a desperate sort of efficiency, unbolting their rifles and taking up positions behind the steel plating of the vehicles. Every movement was amplified by the stillness of the evening, the metallic snap of a rifle bolt sounding like a crack of thunder in the quiet glen. The wind died down completely, leaving the valley in a state of absolute, breathless stasis. Not a single bird called from the trees, not a single insect chirped in the long grass. It was as if the natural world had sensed the approaching violence and withdrawn into itself. The soldiers stood frozen, their eyes scanning the ridges and the gorse-covered mounds above. Every rustle of a leaf or shift of a stone felt like a precursor to the end. They waited for a voice, a command, or the telltale flash of sunlight on a gun barrel. But there was only the graying light and the smell of the damp Irish earth. The trap was sprung, the path was blocked, and in that long, agonizing minute of silence, the history of a nation hung suspended in the cool, twilight air of West Cork, waiting for the first spark to ignite the darkness. The stillness of the valley was not merely a lack of sound. It was a physical weight, a tension that seemed to press against the windshield of the yellow Leyland touring car. As the convoy rounded the sharp curve near Carroll's Bridge, the world was painted in the soft, bruised purples and grays of an Irish twilight. It was approximately 8 o'clock on the evening of August 22nd, 1922. The air was damp with the coming night, carrying the faint scent of wild heather and wet stone. Then, the breath that the valley had been holding finally broke. A single, sharp crack echoed from the high ground to the left. It was a lone rifle shot, high and piercing, splitting the silence like a physical blow. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the fading echo and the steady, oblivious thrum of the touring car's engine. The response was instantaneous. Before the echo of the first shot could die away, the hillside erupted. A volley of fire swept down from the upper lane, where hidden men lay behind the stone walls and the gorse. The sound was a frantic, rhythmic chatter, the distinctive, metallic snap of Mauser rifles answering the deeper bark of Lee Enfields. Bullets began to whine through the air, singing a lethal tune as they ricocheted off the road or bit into the heavy wooden frames of the escort vehicles. You could hear the sharp ping of lead meeting the armored skin of the Rolls-Royce car, a sound like hail hitting a tin roof, but far more sinister. The peace of the morning was now a distant memory, replaced by the frantic, acrid reality of an ambush in the mouth of flowers. In the touring car, Emmett Dalton reacted with the instinct of a soldier who had survived the trenches of the Great War. He shouted for the driver to increase speed, to drive like hell and clear the kill zone. But Michael Collins, sitting beside him, was a man of a different temperament. He had spent his life in the shadows, and now that the shadows had come for him, he refused to run. "Stop," he commanded, his voice steady even over the mounting roar of the gunfire. "We will stand and fight them." The convoy screeched to a halt, the tires skidding on the loose gravel of the narrow road. The doors of the Crossley tender swung open, and the escort troops tumbled out, seeking the meager protection of the muddy ditches and the stone fences that lined the path. Then came the thunderous voice of the Sliab na Mban. The armored car, a gray ghost in the fading light, began to earn its keep. The Vickers machine gun in its turret let out a continuous, devastating roar, a heavy tack-tack-tack that vibrated through the very ground. It poured fire into the upper lane, the muzzle flashes illuminating the gray metal of the car in brief, strobe-like bursts. White smoke began to billow from the turret, thick and sulphurous, swirling around the vehicle until it looked like a prehistoric beast breathing fire. The machine gunner, John McPeak, searched for targets in the darkening gorse, his fire pinning the ambushers down and forcing them to keep their heads low against the earth. For those few minutes, the superior firepower of the National Army seemed to dominate the valley. The sensory experience of the engagement was overwhelming. The smell of burnt cordite hung heavy in the air, mixing with the damp mist to create a thick, choking haze. Beneath the frantic rattle of the machine gun, you could hear the individual shouts of men, the metallic clatter of rifle bolts being worked, and the frantic scraping of boots against the road. Collins himself had moved to the cover of a low bank, his own rifle braced against the earth. He was calm, focused, a commander in his element even as the world around him dissolved into chaos. The smoke from the armored car drifted across the road, obscuring the view and turning the men into silhouettes against a backdrop of gray stone and green hills. Every few seconds, the heavy vibration of the Vickers gun would falter, only to start again, a mechanical heart beating out the rhythm of the battle. The confusion was absolute. In the dim light, it was impossible to see exactly where the shots were coming from, only the flashes from the hillside and the dust kicked up by bullets hitting the road. The National Army troops were spread out, some firing from behind the wheels of the Crossley tender, others lying flat in the damp grass of the ditch. The sound of the engagement echoed off the surrounding hills, making it seem as if hundreds of men were involved rather than just a handful. It was a tactical nightmare, a narrow passage, high ground held by an unseen enemy, and the light of day rapidly failing. As the smoke from the Sliab na Mban grew thicker, the initial volley transitioned into a sustained, desperate exchange of fire that would determine the fate of a nation in the gathering gloom. The confusion in the valley of the Mouth of Flowers was absolute. As the first sharp cracks of rifle fire echoed off the surrounding ridges, the instinct of the men in the convoy was to flee the kill zone. Inside the yellow Leyland Thomas touring car, Major General Emmett Dalton felt the visceral surge of adrenaline that comes with a sudden ambush. He leaned forward, his voice strained and urgent against the rising cacophony, and shouted to the driver to drive like hell. It was the logical command, the tactical response to an unseen enemy holding the high ground. The road ahead was narrow and winding, but speed was their only shield against the leaden rain beginning to fall from the hillside. For a heartbeat, The engine roared in anticipation of a desperate escape, the tires gripping the loose gravel of the West Cork Road, ready to propel the commander-in-chief toward the safety of the next bend. But then a hand reached out, firm and unwavering, and a voice cut through the panic like a blade. Michael Collins would not run. In a moment that historians have dissected for over 100 years, he countermanded Dalton's order with a ferocity that brooked no argument. "Stop," he yelled, his voice booming over the rattle of gunfire. "We will get out and fight them." It was a decision born of a rebel's heart, a refusal to turn his back on a fight in the county of his birth. The driver, caught between the conflicting commands of two generals, slammed on the brakes. The touring car skidded, its heavy frame slewing slightly to the side as a thick cloud of summer dust rose from the parched earth, momentarily veiling the men in a gray shroud. The screech of the brakes was followed by the heavy thud of doors swinging open. Collins did not hesitate. He vaulted from the car, his boots hitting the dirt with a heavy, purposeful rhythm, trading the relative security of the vehicle's metal skin for the open, vulnerable air of the valley floor. The air in the valley had changed in an instant. The sweet, heavy scent of late August wildflowers and damp grass was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, acidic tang of cordite. It is a smell that lingers in the back of the throat, metallic and burnt, the undeniable scent of a world transitioning into violence. The soundscape was a terrifying layer of noise. There was the high-pitched zing of bullets passing overhead, the heavy thump of rounds striking the bodywork of the cars, and the rhythmic, chattering roar of the Vickers machine gun from the Slieveneman, the 1920 Rolls-Royce armored car that brought up the rear of the convoy. The brass shell casings began to spill from the armored car, clattering onto the road like heavy rain on a tin roof, each one a spent second of time in this frantic struggle for survival. Collins moved with the practiced grace of a soldier, his eyes fixed on the ridges where the flashes of muzzle fire betrayed the positions of the hidden ambushers. The commander-in-chief sought cover behind a low, rough stone wall that lined the edge of the road. It was a modest defense, a humble boundary of stacked rocks and earth, damp with the evening dew and covered in patches of dark green moss. He pressed his body against the cold stones, the rough texture of the granite biting into his uniform. Here, in the shadows of the valley floor, the light was fading fast. The sun had dipped behind the hills, leaving the road in a deepening twilight that made every shadow on the hillside look like a sniper. Collins worked the bolt of his rifle, the mechanical slide of metal on metal, a grounding, familiar sound amidst the chaos. He was not merely a leader here. He was a rifleman, returning fire with a steady hand, his breath coming in slow, measured draws despite the storm of lead whistling through the air above his head. Beside him, Dalton continued to plead, his voice barely audible over the din of the firefight. He urged Collins to move, to take cover behind the massive, iron-clad bulk of the Slieveneman, which sat idling in the middle of the road like a prehistoric beast. The armored car was supposed to be their salvation, its thick plating impervious to the small arms fire of the irregulars on the heights. But the tactical advantage was beginning to crumble. The Vickers machine gun, which had been pouring a steady stream of defensive fire toward the ridge, suddenly fell silent. A jam, the ultimate nightmare of the machine gunner, had silenced their most potent weapon. In the sudden, ringing silence that followed the gun's failure, the sounds of the ambushers grew clearer. The shouting of orders from the hills, the distinct crack of Mauser rifles, and the whistling of bullets that seemed to find their mark with increasing accuracy as the irregulars realized the machine gun was out of action. Collins seemed emboldened by the danger rather than deterred by it. Seeing movement on the road ahead, perhaps the ambushers attempting to shift their positions or retreat, he rose from behind the safety of the low wall. He ran approximately 15 yards up the road, his figure a stark silhouette against the graying light of the evening. He dropped into a prone position, his chest pressing into the grit and gravel of the road, and resumed his steady, calculated fire. The earth beneath him was warm from the day's sun, but the air was cooling rapidly, carrying the mist of the nearby stream into the fray. He was a man possessed by the momentum of the moment, focused entirely on the sights of his rifle and the movement on the ridge. In this narrow corridor of West Cork, the great Michael Collins was alone with his enemy, separated by only a few hundred yards of heather and the weight of 1,000 years of history. The valley of Bláth was already surrendering to the heavy gloom of a late August evening. It was roughly 8:15 on that Tuesday, the 22nd of August, 1922. The air in West Cork was thick and damp, weighed down by a low-pressure front that had turned the sky into a bruised canvas of deep purples and charcoal grays. In the hollow of the road, the world was a chaotic symphony of sharp, metallic cracks, and the heavy, rhythmic thrum of the Lewis gun from the armored car named Sliab na Mban. The smell of spent cordite and wet earth hung low in the ravine, clinging to the wool uniforms of the men crouched in the ditches. For 20 minutes, the hills had echoed with the violent exchange of lead, but the light was failing fast, making every shadow on the ridge look like a crouched gunman. Michael Collins, the commander-in-chief, was not a man built for the static safety of an armored hull. He was 31 years old, a figure of restless energy who had spent years as a shadow in Dublin, and now, in the open air of his home county, he seemed to thrive on the adrenaline of the confrontation. Earlier, Emmett Dalton had pleaded with him to drive through the ambush, to find safety and speed, but Collins had chosen to stand and fight. He was crouched near the tail of the convoy, his heavy service rifle pressed to his shoulder, peering through the thickening mist toward the ridge where the anti-treaty snipers lay hidden. He saw movement, a few figures beginning to retreat up the hillside, silhouettes against the darkening skyline. He turned to his men, his voice carrying over the din, shouting that they had them on the run. In a moment of fatal bravery, Collins stepped out from the protection of the armored car's steel flank. He moved about 15 yards up the road, seeking a clearer line of sight to finish the engagement. The ground beneath his boots was slick with mud and loose stones, the remnants of a road block made of an old cart and broken glass. As he adjusted his stance to fire, a single, lonely rifle shot rang out from the heights. It didn't have the flat, mechanical sound of the machine guns. It was a sharp, high-velocity crack that seemed to bite into the silence of the valley. The bullet, perhaps a ricochet off the limestone or a direct hit from a marksman's Mauser, found its mark. There was no dramatic cry, only a sharp intake of breath as the world's trajectory changed in a heartbeat. Emmett Dalton would later recount hearing a faint, haunting phrase, "Emmett, I am hit." It was a soft admission, almost a whisper, as the great Michael Collins slumped forward. He did not fall like a man defeated, but rather as if the strength had simply been poured out of him. He landed face down in the West Cork mud, his fingers still curled around the stock of his rifle, his cheek resting against the damp earth of the county that had raised him. Suddenly, the hills went quiet. The ambushers, sensing a change in the air or perhaps simply satisfied with their retreat, ceased their fire. The intense rattling of the machine guns sputtered and died. A heavy, unnatural stillness fell over the valley, broken only by the sound of the wind through the gorse and the frantic splashing of boots in the mire. Dalton and Commandant Sean O'Connell ran toward the fallen figure, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The silence was now more terrifying than the gunfire had been. When they reached him and gently turned him over, the true horror of the wound became clear in the dim, twilight glow. There was a large, gaping injury at the base of his skull, behind the right ear. The mud was already darkening with a deep, crimson stain that the parched earth seemed to drink greedily. O'Connell, overcome with a sudden, crushing grief, knelt in the dirt and began to whisper the act of contrition into Collins's ear, his voice trembling as he sought to provide spiritual passage for a man who appeared already beyond the reach of the living. The scene was one of desperate, hopeless motion in the mud. They worked with trembling hands to apply a field dressing, the white cloth quickly turning red in the fading light. Dalton's uniform was soaked through with water and the blood of his friend, his mind reeling from the impossibility of the moment. The commander-in-chief, the architect of the intelligence war, the man who had outmaneuvered the British Empire, lay silent while his officers wept and struggled to bind a wound that would not close. High above on the ridges, the attackers were mere ghosts now, disappearing into the fog-shrouded hills of the south, unaware in that precise moment that the single bullet of an anonymous sniper had just decapitated the new Irish state. As the light vanished entirely, the men of the convoy realized they could stay in the valley no longer. The threat of a second attack hung in the air like a cold mist. They lifted the heavy, lifeless body of Michael Collins, the weight of him seemingly doubled by the tragedy, and moved toward the touring car. The mud pulled at their boots, making every step a struggle, a physical manifestation of the grief that was beginning to settle over them. They placed him in the back of the car, his head resting on Dalton's shoulder. As the engines groaned back to life, and the convoy began its slow, mournful crawl out of the hollow, the valley of Bláth returned to its ancient, stony silence, leaving only the blood-soaked earth to mark where the sun had set on an era of Irish history. The Valley of the Mouth of Flowers was no longer a place of beauty, but a tomb of shadows. As the final echoes of the gunshots faded into the damp evening air of August 22nd, 1922, a suffocating silence settled over the road. The transition from the chaos of battle to the stillness of death was instantaneous and jarring. Major General Emmett Dalton, his hands stained with the blood of his commander and friend, gave the order to move. There was no time for traditional mourning. The threat of a renewed attack by the anti-treaty forces still loomed in the darkening hills. They lifted the heavy, lifeless frame of Michael Collins and placed him in the back of the yellow Leyland touring car. His head, bandaged in a desperate, futile haste, came to rest on Dalton's shoulder. It was a position of intimate, tragic burden, a commander carrying the weight of his fallen leader through the literal and figurative darkness of a divided nation. The engine of the touring car turned over with a low, mournful rumble, joined by the heavier, more industrial growl of the Rolls-Royce armored car, the Sliab na Mban. The convoy began to crawl away from the ambush site, but the road back to Cork City was far from clear. The retreating irregulars had done their work with clinical efficiency, not just in the ambush itself, but in the sabotage of the landscape. Every few miles, the headlights of the lead motorcycle, ridden by a wounded but determined scout, illuminated a new nightmare. Massive trees had been felled across the narrow lanes, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers in the mist. Bridges that had stood for generations were now nothing more than jagged heaps of stone in the cold streams below. The direct route was gone, swallowed by the war they were trying to end. They were forced into the labyrinth of the Cork countryside, navigating by memory and instinct in a world without streetlights. The mud was a thick, sucking presence that threatened to claim the heavy wheels of the armored car. At one point, the convoy came to a complete halt before a trench so deep it seemed impassable. The men, exhausted and hollow-eyed, had to dismount. In the freezing drizzle, they put their shoulders to the cold steel of the Sliab na Mban, their boots slipping in the churned earth. The sound of their labored breathing and the rhythmic splashing of water were the only breaks in the heavy silence. They were not just moving vehicles. They were dragging the hope of the Free State through the muck of a backroad farmyard, miles away from help. As the hours stretched toward midnight, the journey took on a dreamlike, nightmarish quality. Dalton later recalled the physical sensation of the body beside him, the way the coldness of death seemed to seep through the fabric of their uniforms. The touring car was an open-top vehicle, and the fine Irish mist turned into a steady, soaking rain. It washed over them, mingling with the blood on the leather seats. Every jolt of the car over the uneven terrain felt like a personal insult to the man who had survived so many narrow escapes only to fall here, on a lonely road in his home county. The smell of petrol, wet wool, and copper hung thick in the air, a sensory map of their collective despair. They reached the village of Crookstown, where the reality of their isolation became even more acute. The houses were dark, the villagers huddled inside, perhaps hearing the approach of the military engines and wondering which side was passing through the night. There was no hero's welcome, only the suspicious silence of a countryside that had seen too much blood. The convoy had to double back, finding detours through fields and narrow borings where the hedges scraped against the sides of the cars. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the dim, flickering glow of the lamps. It felt as though they were traveling through a void, a space where the rules of the world no longer applied, carrying a secret that would surely shatter the coming morning. By the time the outskirts of Cork City finally appeared, it was well past midnight. The city was asleep, its residents unaware that the architect of their new government lay dead in a muddy car just a few streets away. The convoy stopped first at the Sacred Heart Church at Victoria Cross. There, in the dim light of the sanctuary, a priest was summoned to administer the last rites to a man who was already gone. The ritual was brief, the whispered Latin words floating up into the rafters before the men moved on to Shankill Hospital. When they finally arrived at the military hospital around 1 o'clock in the morning, the transition was complete. The big fellow, the indomitable leader of the revolution, was now a casualty of war, ready to be washed and prepared for a journey to Dublin that he would never truly finish. The dark road to Cork had ended, but the long night for Ireland was only just beginning. The outskirts of Cork City were bathed in a heavy, suffocating silence as the sun began to rise on August 23, 1922. The news had moved through the night like a cold wind, leaving a trail of disbelief in its wake. Because the roads to Dublin were still fractured by the violence of the Civil War, blocked by felled trees and broken bridges, the architect of the new state had to be carried home by the sea. Imagine the steady, rhythmic pulse of the steamer, the SS Classic, as it cut through the dark, salt-tinged waters of the Irish Sea. The gentle creaking of the wooden hull and the soft splash of the waves against the side provided a somber lullaby for the fallen leader. In the belly of the ship, wrapped in the tricolor flag he had fought so hard to raise, lay the man they called the Big Fellow. He was only 31 years old. When the ship finally docked in Dublin, the city was transformed into a landscape of collective grief. Michael Collins was brought to City Hall to lie in state, and for 3 days, the heartbeat of the nation seemed to slow to a crawl. Picture the grand, neoclassical columns of the hall, cast in long, swaying shadows by the hundreds of candles flickering within. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the damp wool of thousands of coats. People from every corner of the island stood in a line that snaked through the narrow streets for miles, waiting in the drizzling rain just to spend a few seconds in silence by his side. There was no loud weeping, only the hypnotic, rhythmic shuffling of feet on cold marble, a steady tide of mourners paying their respects to a dream that felt suddenly, terrifyingly fragile. The funeral on August 28th was a spectacle of sorrow the likes of which the world had rarely seen. An estimated 500,000 people, nearly 1/5 of the entire population, lined the route from the Pro-Cathedral to Glasnevin Cemetery. As the gun carriage rolled slowly down Sackville Street, the only sound was the synchronized clip-clop of 6 black horses. Their hooves echoed against the stone buildings like a metronome, marking the end of an era. Thousands of soldiers marched with their rifles reversed, a traditional sign of mourning that created a forest of dark wood and steel. The sun occasionally broke through the heavy gray clouds, glinting off the brass instruments of the military bands playing a slow, mournful dirge. It was a moment of suspended animation, where the chaos of the revolution was momentarily quelled by a profound, velvet stillness. even as he was laid to rest among the towering Celtic crosses of Glasnevin. The mystery of his final moments began to thicken like the evening mist in West Cork. For over a century, the identity of the person who pulled the trigger at Béal na Bláth has been whispered in the shadows. Many pointed toward Denny's, often called Sonny O'Neill, a former marksman who had served in the British Army before joining the anti-treaty forces. Theories suggest a single, fatal shot from a distance, perhaps a ricochet off the road's stony surface, or a bullet fired in the confusion of the twilight ambush. Because no official inquest was ever held, the truth remains buried in the Valley of the Flowers. The lack of a definitive answer has allowed the man to transform into a legend, his life and death becoming a permanent part of the Irish fog, forever elusive and forever mourned. We are left now with what historians call the unfinished work. Michael Collins had a vision for Ireland that extended far beyond the battlefield. He spoke of a nation that would be a shining light of peace and self-governance. As you drift towards sleep, consider the weight of that legacy. The violence eventually faded, replaced by the soft green moss that now covers the stone walls of the valley where he fell. The turbulent rivers have settled into a calm, steady flow, and the fields of Cork are quiet under the moonlight. The big fellow's journey ended in the heat of a summer evening, but his dream of a peaceful home endured, woven into the very fabric of the hills and the rain. The work he began is no longer a burden of the past, but a quiet hope that lingers in the silence of the night. The weight of history begins to lift from your shoulders now, replaced by the warmth and softness of the present moment. The images of the steamship, the flickering candles of City Hall, and the winding funeral processions are fading into a gentle blur. The echoes of the past are growing faint, leaving you in the sanctuary of your own breath. You have traveled through the shadows of 1922 and back into the safety of the now. Let the details of the investigation dissolve. There is nothing left to solve and nothing left to carry. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.